Richard, do you want to start or you want me to begin?
I just hit record, just so you know you are recording.
Okay. Richard, I'm not sure if you can hear me. Your face is not responding in a way that I think you can hear me, but I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Yep, that tells us Richard has to reboot because his mic's not working. So we'll go ahead and launch in, and he will join us when he gets back. Good morning, everybody. Just wanted to quickly do a review of our agenda. We have a busy day ahead of us today. We're going to quickly go through what we have going on and then launch into a presentation by TJ Poor of the Public Service Department and David Hill from EFG to talk about the higher level results of the LEAP models mitigation pathways analysis. Talk about what LEAP can and can't show us, go into sort of next steps and how we work with this information. And then we're going to do a quick overview of the stakeholder engagement that's happened by sector to this point. The links for those summaries are included in the agenda. And then we're going to talk about sort of what our next steps are and our work plan is over the next several weeks to arrive at the production of proposed actions to the full council on the 5th of October, which is coming up right around the corner. We have a lot of information coming in between now and then. And so it's behooves us to have a good plan and then be adaptable as things will inevitably change. So with that, TJ and David, I would ask you to go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Peter. I think I'm first up. Thanks for having me, TJ Poor, Public Service Department. I'm getting a little feedback, so it's good mute. Okay, I think it's gone. Thank you. So I'm going to just start with a quick update of the LEAP modeling and pathways and scenarios to date, quickly show a few very high-level results and takeaways, and wrap up with some next steps before turning it over to David, who will talk about kind of the contract and next steps with the EFG and moving forward with the LEAP model and the climate action plan. Can you see my slides now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I do want to note before I really get started is that really diving into all the detailed assumptions and the details of sector level results aren't really the intent of the presentation today. I want to, there's task group meetings that have been established that we can go into more detail in each sector, and that will really be the appropriate place to kind of dive into the weeds. But I'm going to give you, as Peter said, a flavor of the initial results and what you can expect as we go forward. Just a quick reminder, the department and the Agency of Natural Resources have been working with NESCOM and Stockholm Environment Institute to develop a Vermont-specific LEAP model. It's an accounting model with some optimization features in the electric sector that tracks consumption, production, resources in all sectors, and combines those interactive effects of policies into one relatively easy to use model. So several months ago, we introduced you to the model. I'm not going to go into much more detail on it. Since then, several key stakeholders like EAN, given their pathways modeling, have been helping an early review of the assumptions, and EFG has had the model since mid-July, I believe, and has had access to the working version as we go, so we can, so we're not just kind of handing something now, it's been ongoing here. This slide just shows where we are in the process. The multicolored sections of the slide are where we're kind of iterating as well in the mitigation scenarios, mitigation pathways, and also in the cost section. You'll notice that the land use change forestry block is still red, and that is not completed. That's really mainly because it realized that the best forecast assumptions for the sector are really being developed in the council now and related to the carbon as part of the carbon budget and other work being performed by the subcommittees. So there's still some work to do on the non-energy emissions. So thus far, we've created kind of what I'm going to refer to, I think, as the base model. We have a business as usual forecast that's been developed, and that was, an initial version of that was presented back in June, and modifications have been made based on feedback received in June. And a central mitigation scenario, and that's really just a series of assumptions on technological change and efficiencies that will get us to meet the GWSA requirements. The mitigation scenario then developed two sensitivities. These two sensitivities are really driven by the energy planning process, I think. A biofuel, bio-heavy emphasis, and in the electric sector, a focus on local electricity resources. I'm going to focus really on the central mitigation scenario in these slides, and we can go into questions, particularly in the task group meeting. So now you have a full agenda today. Okay, so early results. That gray line on this slide is the business as usual forecast, and the other three lines are the different scenarios, with the pinkish one being the central mitigation scenario. You can see, and I think confirmation of what folks already knew here is that the 2025 goals, we're not too far off, but there's a big lift from business as usual to the mitigation pathways to get to the 2030 goals. I've heard folks in this committee say that before. I've heard, as kind of a result of the EAN pathways modeling. It's not news, but it is confirmation through this modeling, I think, that that is the case. And because this is the path. This slide is still focused on energy. As I said before, the land use piece is not done yet. I wanted to show this as an example of what can be done. The GWSA has a requirement for proportional reductions in emissions. If you look at the bar all the way on the right, that would be the remaining emissions by sector if reductions were done proportionally. And then we have these other pathways that actually are fairly similar. The biofuels is a little different than the other two in terms of the remaining emissions in 2050. When you look at this slide, you see the proportional reductions. Transportation still has a solid mustard color chunk there of emissions. Each of those are smaller in the pathways. So what this says is the modeling that's done to date in the pathways get a bigger reduction from the transportation sector proportionally than the other sectors. And that, as we go forward in the climate action plan, the requirement is that there's proportional reductions. So just wanted to kind of point that out in this slide.
TJ, let me just jump in quickly. That's a point of discussion that we've had quite a bit in terms of the proportion, what that proportional means and how strict it is, because there are some pretty significant constraints based on the proportionality and how do you define proportionality. So just appreciate that there is lots to it, and appreciate you digging into that one.
Right, and this has I didn't have it for today, but I have a slide that has it in 2030, and we can actually get it for any year if there's if that helps or the conversation or helps inform the conversation. Here's how this looks in terms of final energy demand versus the business as usual. So those kind of checkered groups are energy that isn't used relative to BAU. The top of the area there would be the business as usual. You can see that emissions in most sectors goes down. We don't see a lot of, energy demand in most sectors goes down. We don't see a lot of reduction in terms of industrial usage, or even commercial for that matter, although it is reduced. And then you can see where there are avoided BTU. And so a lot of, as you all know, a lot of electro technologies, EVs or heat pumps, are inherently more efficient than their fossil counterparts. So that's where you're seeing a lot of that reduction. There's some other reduction in kind of a mitigation scenario as a much higher weatherization than a business as usual. So there's other reduced demand there as well. And I only have a couple more slides. I can't see people's hands here, so if people have questions. Okay. That sounded like Joey. I can't see you either, but.
Sorry. Thanks,
That's
TJ. This is really important, and I just want to make sure that I understand it, and then others who are watching and participate understand it. Can you put a more fine point on what is the central mitigation scenario? What is embedded in that?
I can. So there's, I almost added a slide on that, and I think I probably should have. So I was gonna, well, I'll just do it without a slide. So it's an assumption of mitigation strategies. So there's a electric vehicle forecast of more electric vehicles. There's a high weatherization forecast that came from, and we had an Act 62 proceeding following Act 62 of 2019. Efficiency Vermont put forth a forecast of costs and units weatherized and savings from those units from into the future. It's got heat pumps, a high estimation of heat pumps. It's got some RNG in it, and biofuels. In the central mitigation, there's some, and then in the bio emphasis, there's a whole lot more. And so there are those types of technological and efficiency gains, and some fuel switching. I could get a list for you. I'm afraid that it might take more time for me to pull up a slide than we have here, though. Does that give you a flavor of it, or?
Yeah, it does. But I mean, I guess it's obviously critical to know, like, yeah, what that list is, what those programs, or like the scale. I mean, and the sort of specificity around the number of weatherization, like retrofits, like that is embedded in that. Like that would be incredibly helpful to know as we're making program and policy recommendations that ideally are aligned with something like this.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I was there's a balance for today and limited time onto how detailed. There's a task lead buildings sector, for instance, workshop where we'll go. There's the opportunity, at least as I understand it, to go into detail on each of those individual assumptions. So I didn't present them here, but happy to share them. And I think it's important to understand that the model is, especially as we go really far out, is really indicative. It's not going to tell us things like we need exactly 120,000 homes weatherized by 2030 and exactly 100%, 240,000 single family homes weatherized by 2050. It could tell us we need around that number, and you can enter into the model those assumptions and see what the results are, but it's not going to tell you which numbers to enter in. Does that make sense? It's that kind of work needs to be done by your committees, the department has done some of that in in matching up with what EAN had in some respects and getting feedback from other folks as well. So I hope I answered your question. I'm trying to not get too detailed in the time allotted, but I also want to answer your question.
No, I'll turn it over to Peter and maybe, I think that's super helpful. I think indicative, yes, that makes a tremendous amount of sense to me. I also think, to your point, like this is an iterative process and this will be a model that we can build upon. But I'm trying to just wrap my head around like the scale and what we're actually talking about as we make recommendations that that are going to get us to the 2025 target, because the whole reason we're undertaking this endeavor is because we've been talking about this stuff and nibbling at the edges for a long time, and now we're required to get off the dime. And thankfully, that's happening because we're in a predicament. So this is incredibly helpful. Jane's question about what central refers to, I'm wondering if you can answer that as well.
Yeah, central is just kind of a term of art that SEI came up with, and we've adopted, I guess, as just kind of like the base initial assumptions to get us to the target. So we know we had to get to the targets. We weren't going to create the model that didn't reach the targets, and so it was kind of it's almost like the first the base scenario, and then the bio heavy and the electric focus kind of are variants on that scenario. So that's really the only reason it's called central, is because of the one that the others bounce off of.
Right. TJ, I would recommend keeping going. I think if we can get a summary of what's in that and the different breakdown that we can share around with everybody, I think that would be very useful.
Okay, great.
At a later point.
Yep, will do. I just have a couple more slides and then turn it over to David. But this similarly is just kind of the final energy demand by fuel. You can see the big reduction in the increase in electricity. Renewables on this slide refers to thermal renewables, but not electric sector renewables. And you can see decline in natural gas and oil products, increase in efficiency and electricity. So initial takeaways, I just wanted to put a few on here, but I already mentioned the first couple that, or this maybe just the second one, but this model really uses mostly existing technologies as it is now, and the targets can be met with existing technologies. Again, that's something else we already, I think, knew. It confirms what EAN came up with earlier and what folks have been talking about. The 2025 requirements look achievable. 2030 look a lot more challenging. So we really need to start now. It's not an excuse for delay. It's that, man, those 2030 ones were pretty far off. Electrification plays a large role. I already mentioned. One thing I haven't mentioned is that, there's other pollutants that are in this model, and there's not trade-offs between these scenarios and emissions of other pollutants. In all the mitigation scenarios, other pollutants are mitigated also. So it's not like you reduce greenhouse gas and nitrous oxides go up. Everything goes down. And then there's other takeaways that are sector specific, but I do just want to reemphasize that the model doesn't do the specific design of the policy. It tracks its a policy's expected impacts and shows how it interacts with other policies. So you can put a bunch of policies in and see how they interact, and on the technology, the building stock, the equipment stock. So the policy impacts are basically an exogenous input that you put into the model. And so as it goes forward, one, continued fine tuning of the assumptions for the scenarios. This was super high level right here, but we're, as more people start to see this, ask questions, there are more refinements. We can always get better. There's a point at which we need to kind of say, okay, this is pretty close. It looks good. It may not be perfect, but again, this is an indicative model. We have the task group leads, EFG and CADMIS are are to develop sensitivities and adjustments to the mitigation scenarios. So that's when you guys have the policies you want to put in specifically and have the forecasts, those will go into the model. And the EFG was hired in part because they have the experience with LEAP to do that. And then this came up yesterday in the Science and Data Committee, but there will be a technical report that is going to be published and be very public also. And these assumptions are public. I'll share them, but once it's documented and what we're really basing the climate action plan, the comprehensive energy plan on, there's going to be a full assumptions and methodologies report. And I just want to make that clear. And then finally, I just really want to emphasize this from my perspective. The expectation is that there's really one model, and we're not creating something for the climate action plan, something for the energy plan. There's one model. We've kind of started it and moved it to a spot so far with the feedback and help of a lot of interested folks. And we look forward to kind of continuing to improve it and move it forward. But it's really still one model for the energy plan and the action plan. If the cross-sector mitigation committee and EFG models some other sensitivities, it's not like the energy plan is going to ignore that in its path going forward. So I think that's all I have. So I'm going to stop sharing. I apologize. I probably took a little bit longer than I had, but Liz, hi.
Hey, TJ, thanks. That was great. Going back to the process slide you had, you don't have to put it back up on screen. I'm just calling it back to your mind. The one that showed the central mitigation modeling and then the two sensitivities.
Mm-hmm.
I think I get the biofuels one where it sounds like you're making an assumption of a greater proportion of biofuels primarily in the thermal sector compared to, for example, heat pumps is my guess, or of course the fossil that presently is the most prevalent. But I don't understand the other one. The box said, I think it said local electricity or something. And from all of the other slides, it looked like you were doing sort of an end user analysis of energy at the consumer or the business, et cetera. So I don't understand what local electricity means in your scenario.
Right. So thank you for that question. It is really, so the slides I put up are end user kind of end consumption slides. The electric sector modeling is the local version of that essentially just puts a constraint on saying that more of the resources that are purchased to meet the electricity needs come from in-state rather than from the regional market. And so it's intended to show kind of what the amounts of renewable energy that would need to be cited and what the types that may get chosen under that scenario.
So did you use a different GHG or renewability profile for the electricity mix, or instead will that actually kind of matter more? Because it looked like the lines were the same. So from a GHG reduction, are you using a similar mix, whether it's regional or local, and the impacts will be seen more when you go to IMPLAN for the economic modeling piece? I don't understand how it affects the GHG portion, I guess.
So right now, it doesn't affect the GHG portion. It affects, it is more the IMPLAN and kind of citing questions and cost. And so that's not to say that it can't. Right now, all of the emissions are calculated using emissions factors that are consistent with the current climate inventory. Those are numbers that are fairly easy to plug and play, as I understand it. And if there were other numbers, there's discussion of a supplemental inventory. If and when that is ready, then those numbers could be plugged in to see kind of differences. As it is now, it's, hydro has a value and solar has a value. It doesn't distinguish between HQ Solar, or sorry, HQ Solar, HQ Hydro, and Connecticut River Hydro, or Green River Reservoir Hydro.
Right, and it's all borders analysis, so it's solar, not solar, including inputs for the panels or whatever. Yeah.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah, that's helpful. I just didn't understand how it affected what you were showing on the screen, but the bottom line is that scenario probably doesn't affect, at least in this early run, what you're showing on the screen. It's really the other analysis.
Correct.
Thank you.
Great. Are there other questions for TJ? Thank you for that, TJ. We'll obviously we have lots more to think about and talk about, I'm sure, over the course of the next few weeks. So appreciate you doing that overview for us. I'm now ready for David.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just getting, let's see. Is that sharing now on the screen correctly?
Yes.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, thank you, TJ, and thank you everybody for joining today. What I'll do, and I took some snapshots while we were talking from the LEAP model that can try to help further answer some of the questions, but I want to just give an overview of where the Cadmus EFG team is in the pathways analysis, which is our task 4, and kind of give an overview of how we're planning to work with the existing model. As TJ said, it's one model. And the model, you know, Blair Hamilton, who many people know, used to say the modeling is to help sharpen the questions. It doesn't give us the answers. It helps us sharpen the questions. And so that's something I very much keep in mind when we're doing these things. But I'll lay out what we're looking at sector by sector. And then Jane has arranged for each of the sector task leads some follow-up meetings, starting just in, I think even tomorrow morning is the first one of those with the electricity sector. And those are the places where we will attempt to dive in a little bit more to talk about how do the policies that are coming out of this, you know, the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee's work and the work of others, how are they represented in LEAP so that the model is giving an accurate representation of what we think the mitigation pathways are, and it allows us in the development of the climate action plan a fair comparison for those options. So it's really about framing and prioritizing kind of the mitigation opportunities that we have. As TJ said, it's apparent that for 2030 the gap is larger, and so, you know, understanding how these are characterized, following on Joey's, you know, what are the numbers that are associated with the mitigation opportunities and how do those get combined to come up with pathways that are meeting the targets. That's really where the macro process is. For the EFG and Cadmus, the Cadmus EFG team, we have the initial pathways analysis informing what will be the presentation from this committee to the full Climate Council on October 5th. We have the initial pathways analysis, which will be recommendations by sector and Excel tables that look at existing initiatives by sector, and then also jurisdictional issues. So other supporting, you know, there are current state activities or policies or programs by sector and kind of the levels of activities that are underway, identify other things such as federal standards that would also be important to consider, impact of the VCC recommended strategies on the emissions reductions that will show up through the, you know, kind of incorporating or trying to, what I'm seeing it as really kind of knitting together what the recommended strategies from the subcommittees are and how that's reflected in the LEAP. We want to make sure that the LEAP modeling is accurately reflecting the pathways and the strategies that want to be brought forward in the plan. And so then there will be the preliminary pathway recommendations, LEAP inputs, and the outputs. So it's refining, putting a finer point on what TJ was presenting, making sure that what's represented in the LEAP model is consistent with the strategies. Then the final pathway report and executive summary, the very final version of that due just at the end of November, but that will spell out in more detail the 2025, 30, and 50 policies, programs, and initiatives required to meet the reduction targets. So there's both a forward and backward, although the time for the iteration, in this cycle gets compressed. This graphic got a little bit compressed, the text in it, but TJ mentioned the EAN pathways modeling, the LEAP modeling that's been going on for the CEP, the Public Service Department's cost of carbon reduction model that was part of our early task to review things like that. Development of sheets that we've developed in terms of inputs for additional LEAP inputs or modifications to what's in the LEAP sector currently, LEAP model currently. Some of what SEI, just the slides that TJ was presenting today are based on version 1.63 of the LEAP model that SEI has been working on, and some of the feedback that we've been providing has already been incorporated into that model, but we continue to kind of iterate and try to improve the modeling. That will inform economic analysis that's using an input-output model, kind of one of the various means that's used for economic impact analysis modeling. So outputs in changes in spending in both capital and then operating expenses by sector from the LEAP model then are used to inform changes to economy-wide direct, indirect, and induced spending, and come up with both at 2030 and out through 2050, the kind of the economic impact implications of meeting the targets. Those analyses, both the LEAP model and the M-Plan modeling that our team are doing, then go to inform the climate action plan, and the policies and strategies that are in that plan are then informing, kind of looping back on those black arrows, the inputs that are going into the LEAP model, et cetera. So the approach that we're taking to the pathways analyses build on the existing model, the modeling that SEI and that has been done, with the department and with EAN pathways. I would say existing models in a sense, EAN pathways, but also the LEAP model. As TJ said, there's going to be one model, kind of a LEAP model that will be Comprehensive Energy Plan and HAP. And I am more commonly now thinking that it's really important to synthesize what the Climate Council, the pathways and the mitigation pathways that are in LEAP, just make sure that those are coherent and accurately reflecting. So the mitigation pathways, Joey's question again, what's in that central mitigation pathway? Is that consistent with what the Climate Council thinks is in the Climate Action Plan? So we've got an analysis in the Climate Action Plan that are consistent, mutually informative. So to do that, we have to identify if there are, say, gaps in the existing analyses, an area, just examples, district heating was not included in some of the earlier versions of the LEAP modeling. There were some areas where there were costs, transmission distribution costs weren't necessarily being included. So are there gaps in areas where either there's a mitigation strategy or there may be a cost component that isn't currently reflected? So additional strategies, measures, or categories. What is the depth and the pace of emissions reductions and adoption of the strategies and the technologies that reduce emissions? And what are the costs and performances? So our fundamental task is really the synthesis, but as part of that, we're trying to do as much as we can, a review, and also provide potential places where there may be modifications to some of the cost or performance data that are in there. And then finally, to also look at the supporting policies and initiatives both existing and or potential future ones that should be incorporated or that are consistent with the mitigation pathways that are identified. LEAP won't say how those policies and initiatives need to be structured. It doesn't say, for example, give the answer to what level of incentive is needed to encourage the adoption rate for EVs that are in the model. That's a subsidiary kind of at the program or the initiative level, a finer level of detail that is not incorporated in the LEAP modeling in terms of incentives and how to catalyze the changes that are expected. The timeline is very rapid. Here we are, the presentation kind of today is that first green bar. Sector analysis meeting is happening in this coming week. So a presentation, I think, again on the 23rd, perhaps to you, and then materials from that after that to inform the presentation to the Climate Council on October 5th. And the scenario in-plan and further analyses then kind of down on the scenario analysis coming later. So very compressed, but we're working hard across a number of different groups and subsectors, and we'll continue to make as best progress we can. I'll go through the sectoral overviews quickly. I did this just to try to help inform the structure. The question that Joey asked, this for the central mitigation scenario, and then also to follow up on Liz's question, if you look on the left side, the mitigation pathway is the central mitigation pathway. And on the right there, those are the elements that are included. And each one of these has an individual characterization. So the renewable distributed gas or these other elements. So the central mitigation pathway has all of these elements incorporated in it: the fossil cooking phase out by 2035, heat pump space heating reaching 90 by 2040, high weatherization. As TJ said, LEAP it's an accounting framework. It's relatively easy to use, but the way this is represented in the LEAP model is somewhat complicated, but we can walk through and try to tease out and work with SEI to make sure that the what's incorporated in these scenarios is consistent with and well understood. Likewise, the local electricity resources pathway, same thing, where it's the mitigation 3 local electric resources, and it includes these elements, which specifically there's an early HQ exit. There's, I think, a doubling of behind the meter PV. It has the renewable electricity increasing to 100% by 2040. So, and a number of the other elements that we saw in the central mitigation scenario that are not electric are also included in this local electric resource pathway. I'm going to keep moving here relatively quickly. I don't have the screen up that lets me see if people are asking questions right now, but I think it's probably best if I go through these. I'm just going to go through sector by sector and give some high overviews of the things we're looking at, and then I'd be happy to take questions, but interrupt me if there's
David, you do have a question from Christine. If
Sure, go ahead, Christine.
Hi, David. This is super duper helpful. I'm completely confident of you and the team work. My main question at the moment is, if those of us who've been talking, about this stuff for a long time have missed an important pathway or have been promoting a pathway that really isn't a highly effective pathway for the state moving forward, will you all be telling us that?
It's a good question, Christine. To first order, I don't anticipate that will happen, I think, is probably the right answer at this point. I don't think that we are going to say the small, we're not looking into the small modular nuclear reactor pathway for Vermont right now. It's not been discussed. It's not being put forward. Our work is kind of based off the work that's consistent with what we've seen a lot of places, that electrification and decarbonized grid and efficiency in combination are the ways that can help to meet, and paying attention to the non-CO2 emissions, to short-lived climate pollutants, trying to do this in a comprehensive way. Those are the fundamental elements I think that the state has been discussing and that we're primarily looking at. We're not looking at Vermont's pathway to mitigation is carbon sequestration and storage. So by the end of this report, we will not be coming out with something that says you really should be doing small modular reactors or carbon sequestration. It's going to be focused on the elements primarily that are here.
Okay, I guess, but if you all do really see something where you think we don't have it right, I really hope you'll tell us that.
Definitely, within these scenarios, yes, we are identifying some elements that we think are important to include. The fact that district heating has been discussed for a long time in Vermont, and we think that is something that can be incorporated into one of the scenarios as an example.
Yep, thank you.
Yep. So
If you've got one more question from Liz.
Yep.
Hey, just to follow up on the question that you just answered, can you talk a little bit about how you did then make some of the choices that are shown on these pathways and scenarios? It's getting toward what was the basis for choosing them. My assumption is they were based upon your potential recommendations, but I guess focusing on the slide right in front of you, for example, without knowing the mix, it's hard to ask the question right, but why behind the meter solar, for example, rather than local solar connected in front? And, why that choice versus some other, and what's the mix and what's the year, and how did you make those decisions?
Yeah. It's an excellent question. And this is I will say a complicated multi-party process. I'm presenting these. This is what's in the LEAP model currently. These aren't necessarily, this is not based on our kind of the Cadmus EFG team's recommendations. It's what's in the model currently.
Yeah. So
David, I might be able to chime in and help a little bit on this, because I think so it depends on the assumption, I guess, but where there were forecasts available or other assumptions made. For instance, I mentioned the weatherization one earlier. We had a forecast ready to go for the central mitigation scenario, and we used that to see where it would land. And we had a high electric vehicle forecast that was done as part of the Velco long-range transmission plan. And some of those ultimately may have needed to be tweaked a little bit to make the goals or make the targets. And so kind of those were there is some iterative and judgment included. The best estimates, again, like David said, through kind of the multi-party effort, we tried to be consistent with what folks knew in a lot of instances of the EAN pathways model, in terms of how that showed progress as well for the first go around. Yeah. So I don't know if that, that's not an assumption by assumption rundown, but that's kind of the strategy, is where we had forecasts, use those, and then kind of fill in afterwards.
Yeah, but there probably are others, and I'll just use a different one. The fossil cooking phase out by 2035. If that's 100% phase out and you chose that year, somebody came up with 100% and somebody came up with 2035. Are those places where it's more like this is where you're starting and there's going to be more conversation? Or that's that, you know what I mean? I get the ones that have public process or you know, well understood models that you're relying upon. Some of the other ones, I'm just trying to understand where they actually come from, since if you know, if we're going to rely on or the
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. The one other source that I should have mentioned was other states. So Massachusetts and Maine have recently done Global Warming Solution Act efforts and modeling, and so we borrowed as well. So, you know, for a particular year there is, and so I think there's opportunities to continue to iterate on this. You know, because going back to what I said earlier is that this is all indicative of, because there's a specific year and a percent in a model, it doesn't mean that we, you know, that's the policy. It's indicative of a path forward that gives us information. As David said, I really like that, David, to refine the question.
Yeah, and Liz, it's one of the strengths of the LEAP model, although we are clearly up against time constraints here, but one of the real strengths is that you can relatively easily either change 2035 or change the phase out to 80%, or change or take that out completely and see if you're still meeting your mitigation target. If you don't have, there's not one single strategy that gets us to the targets. That's clear. So you can't, you know, and it could be, you know, the difference between increased behind the meter PV and just, you know, large scale PV, that type of thing. These are, you know, mixes. It's an accounting framework, mixes that can get you there. And the structure of the model allows you to kind of mix and match relatively easily. But I just, the time that we have basically has, here are a set of Lego pieces that do actually meet this, and we can revise and review these, and we're, you know, kind of, I'll give some examples of what we're looking at on these different individual measure items. And this is a good start. I mean, it's a solid foundation for looking both at, you know, several comparative pathways, and then the elements within those pathways that are a frame for Vermont to meet the climate targets.
So Chris,
but as Christine, you know, this ties back in a sense to Christine's point, is that there may be people who would say, oh, Vermont has missed, you know, active carbon sequestration is not in here. It's not anywhere in the model, and it's not being modeled right now. Now, maybe someday it will, or maybe it won't, but these are the pieces that we're working with.
So Chris, I see you have your hand up. Richard, I see you have your hand up. I'm wondering if we can allow David to move forward, because we have 8 minutes left in his time, and a bunch more to get through. If that's possible, I think it would be great if we can move on. And I'm sure we can have more discussion as we think about work planning.
Yeah, I think that would be good, Peter. Thank you. So let me just very quickly, this will be, I apologize, this may be somewhat unsatisfactory by sector. We do have meetings scheduled with each of the sector leads in this coming week to discuss these in a little bit more detail. For each one of the sectors, kind of a primary number one task is the existing initiatives in relation to the mitigation pathways and scenarios, existing and possible new initiatives in their relation. So the transportation climate initiative, sales and stock in the model, and the EAN pathway estimates. How, you know, consistent are all of these? If the right now the model is primarily technology and stock turnover focus, there are ways to reduce VMT in the model that aren't necessarily currently part of what the mitigation pathways are. We think that looking at ways that you can reduce VMT as well as having, you know, turnover in the between the EVs and the fossil-based vehicles or biomass fuels, those are important. And to look at how something like Transportation Climate Initiative, TCI, would end up, the projections of what you would have in terms of sales and stock in the model by vehicle classes. Is that consistent with what's in the mitigation pathways? And if there's something in VMT reductions too, how can we incorporate those so that they show up in the mitigation pathways? Charging infrastructure, the required levels and costs, looking into adding some more depth in the model on charging infrastructure. The baseline adoption rates for some of the medium and heavy duty vehicles and costs for battery electric vehicles in the current version may be modified somewhat. And then managed charging, there is an element on one of the scenarios that I was looking at that is a managed EV charging. And then there are several of those options that have to do with different rates of biofuel adoption. And then finally, when we're done with all of that, in our free time, identify key metrics for the tracking tool going forward. So that's an overview. Again, transport is, you know, the largest sector for the emissions. And as TJ was saying, the modeling maybe has a bigger reduction from transport than the other sectors so far to date. So there may be some of the other sectors as this goes forward may take up more of their proportional share, or it may be that the reductions in the transport sector are still appropriate at the levels that have been forecast. On the building sector, starting with the same thing is the existing initiatives in relation to the mitigation pathways, additional initiatives such as the Clean Heat Standard, which in some ways serves as an umbrella for activities like weatherization at scale, or the new construction code, or a rental efficiency initiative. Then 5 through 7 talk about kind of what's in the model in terms of current characterization of the different types of heat pumps, including potentially centrally ducted heat pumps. I mentioned district heating for commercial space and water heating. Liz, you asked about the phase out, the pace of the phase outs for cooking and water heating, and look at the advanced wood heating systems review assumptions. And then again, try to identify metrics for the tracking tool. In the electricity sector, perhaps a few slightly fewer specific items to look at, but starting with the same thing, initiatives and their relation to the mitigation pathways, the increase, say, from after 2032, if we go to 100% RPS, the local renewable generation focus and what that would entail, whether it's just the behind the meter or whether it's larger systems. How are transmission and distribution system upgrades treated? What triggers those? There are some modifications that have gone in just in the latest version. Taylor and the folks at SEI included a per peak increase in peak demand value for transmission upgrades across the system. Managed load shapes, looking at for EVs and potentially for heat pumps, the impact on peak on being able to manage load shapes and identify metrics for the tracking tool. For the non-energy sector, and I should mention that, so the Cadmus EFG team has several subject matter experts working in the transport sector. I'm communicating with them. We have in the building sector, EFG we have Richard Fazy, Chris Nemi, and Liz Bourget working and helping on this. Gabrielle Stebbins is helping me on the electric sector. The non-energy sector, this is work that Jillian Gelford from UVM is helping with on the agricultural elements. And then we have both Cadmus and EFG folks working on things like the ozone depleting substitutes and semiconductor manufacturing. So again, non-energy sector, the existing initiatives in relationship to the pathways, the pace and scale of ODS substitute reductions that are in the model currently. We're looking to see if those are consistent with things like what the refrigerant management program that initiative that say EVT is running, or what has been done in California for looking at reductions from ozone depleting substitutes, the depth and the pace, scale, and cost of those substitutes. Semiconductor manufacturing, it's currently the driver for the increase in semiconductor manufacturing, or the driving activity, is population growth. So maybe modifying that in the model and then seeing if there are potentially other estimates of what could be reduced there. Agricultural soils, enteric fermentation, and manure management. These are all areas where there are rates in the LEAP model currently, and those rates Jillian has been reviewing. And in some cases, we can provide a range of rates, but it's also, there may be good information available on some of these, but others we need to actually probably have before it's known whether what percent decrease or what percent increase in the sequestration from agricultural soils is appropriate is something that we can put in values in the LEAP model, but it also indicates it's sharpening questions. We need to do more research to know what the exact right number is. And so that goes 4 through 7, the land use change, and the rates of decreasing sequestration that are currently in the model for that then influences net emissions. The GWSA targets and most of the modeling that we're working on are the gross emissions. So number 7 is informative of that. Finally, sorry, Peter, I know I'm running into my time limit here, but I'll go through these quickly. There are a number of cross-cutting and then economic analysis assumptions within the model, and we'll also be working with SEI and perhaps others to review some of these. One, the population growth rates in the model and emissions associated with our population growth. One question to consider that I haven't heard brought up is the potential for Vermont's population growth to increase because of in-migration, latest census, those types of things. We may want to have a scenario that has higher population growth. We're reviewing things like the housing demographics, and then there are a number of different settings within the LEAP modeling that can be modified to try to help address different questions that have been raised in some of the other subcommittees. The discount rates that are used for discounting future impacts from the greenhouse gases and things, these are related to the task 3 work we did on the social cost of carbon, and then working to translate the LEAP outputs into in-plan analysis. So, sorry, I had to speed up there a bit, but hopefully that's, I'm sure there are plenty of questions and we can have some discussion.
David, I have questions, but I think we're going to be talking to you next week, correct? So they're fairly specific questions. And that, Peter, does that make sense to not delve into that now?
I think that would be great if you're willing to hold off, Gina.
Yeah, unless there's some benefit to the whole group being part of that conversation, but apparently not, because we don't have enough time.
And Gina, if possible, I mean, I understand if not, but if there are things that what I've presented today raise questions, if for our discussion next week, and I would say this for the other subsectors too, if there are things that this is prompting for you, if you can put them in an email, then we'll try to have, be prepared to answer those.
Well, I can just very quickly say that number 2 on your transport sector slide, reductions in VMT, you're not looking at reductions in VMT according to those next words. You're looking at model technology and stock turnover, not reduction in miles. You're talking about getting more efficient cars on the road, correct? And then there's a discussion going on in the chat about whether you can actually factor in some VMT numbers, VMT reduction models based on land use scenarios. And it was my understanding that that's going to be impossible to do in time for both modeling exercises. But maybe something new is known that I'm not aware of. But those are the.
It's
those are
possible to, yeah, I'll just answer real quick. It is, right now, VMT stay static. It is possible to change that and to have VMT reductions if we want to investigate what the implications of that are, what
But
the
it
right
needs-
numbers are.
But it
Yeah.
needs to be based on something realistic, not just
I
some
understand.
wild-eyed hope of what's in the future. We need to do some land use
Sure.
analysis to,
Yep.
to
Yep.
see what kinds of densities we're talking about and where that's feasible.
Yep.
So anyway, that's a preview. And then the other piece I'm not getting is biodiesel and are we talking about ethanol? Because that's something that we haven't spoke of, and it's not something that I believe the state wants to rely on in terms of a sustainable fuel for the future for transportation. I mean,
Yep.
it is going to be in our mix, but do we consider that mission accomplished if the state's getting a certain amount of ethanol delivered to its borders?
Let's dig into those details in the
Okay.
meeting next week and just see
Yeah.
where those things
Well,
stand.
that gives you a little taste of where
Yep.
some of the things
Thank
that
you.
we have
Yep.
on our mind.
Richard, I see your hands up.
Well, my question was more generic. The detailed ones we can leave for the follow-on meetings next week. That is the discount rate. We've discussed 2% as an appropriate social discount rate.
Yep.
But I understand that LEAP uses 5%. Is that right? So
Not in the
discount rate?
version 1.63 of the model now has a 2% discount rate in it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you, David. Thank you, TJ.
Thank you, everybody.
We will have lots more to work with. Obviously, we're going to discuss some of sort of timelines associated with the work to iterate with this modeling information and in the discussion of our work plan in the next bit. But I do want to transition now so that we can get to the next stage in our agenda, which is to get an overview of the sectoral stakeholder engagement. So Catherine, Jane, I would look to you.
Sure. I'm happy to frame it up, but really I'm hoping that between Catherine and the task leads, you all can speak to the experience and what you were able to learn, and Catherine was able to summarize on your behalf. And then I think the hope of this is some key takeaways to understand how the public engagement through these stakeholder events will impact your work going forward, and then identify really what you weren't able to get out of them. And just I put that out there on the table as we're thinking about moving into the real meat of the public engagement over the course of the next few weeks, how and if possible that we can still work to address that. So yeah, I would love for Catherine to summarize. Go ahead.
And before you get going, David, would you mind stop sharing your screen, please? Great, thank you.
So Catherine, maybe you could, I mean, I'm happy to remind us if we need to of what we were trying to accomplish with this, but I'm hoping that since all three of yours are done and we're moving forward with stakeholder engagement for ag and ecosystems and rural resilience, that we can reflect a bit upon what you learned and how to make it more useful.
I'm happy to talk specifically to the process and what we might learn from the process itself. But, you know, I think the task leads, because they are so immersed in the substance, I'm not going to put you on the spot because I have the summary in front of me and I can sort of quickly go through some of the highlights of the summary. But I wanted to give the task leads an opportunity to talk about what they felt was that they learned. Anything new came out of this, you know, anything that struck you as kind of you heard repeatedly as strong themes. So I would turn, you know, to Liz and Ed for the electricity sector workshops, where the focus was, I think most of the discussion was around the equity questions. There was some good presentations from California on how they're handling equity, and then on the res design process. So Ed and Liz, would you want to say something about what you took away from those two conversations? And I can fill in what I see in the summary that you might not hit. You still have Liz and Ed?
I don't want to monopolize if Ed is on.
Oh, there you are.
Great.
Liz, Ed had to step off, so it's you.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know that I need to take a lot of time in this meeting. There was a number of people who participated. I will say I'm not sure that equals good participation, in the sense that I did feel that we had a similar cross-section of folks that we've had in meetings here. So if I were just looking to provide commentary on the meetings that you have going forward, rather than reviewing what we've already done, thinking through ways to broaden the voices and folks that you have at these stakeholder meetings, I think could be really useful. And the other thing that I would focus on, if it's possible to do so, I thought the presentations we had were helpful, particularly, I guess to all of us. They were certainly helpful to me to hear what California was doing with some of their programs, and then Massachusetts on their specific version of an RPS. So I thought that was great, and something I would replicate in other sectors if possible, bringing in voices from other states just to provide kind of learning. And if there were a even better way to ensure conversation and opinions coming back to us, I think that would be really helpful. I was a little bit disappointed, I guess, in our meeting, not having an opportunity to really have, I know we tried to draw out some feedback, but I'm not sure that really happened as much as it could have. So I'll stop there.
Substance wise, I just note that there was a lot of discussion around particularly, how the responsibility for Vermont is to think regionally about their impact, not just in-state impacts. And that came through pretty clearly from a lot of the comments. I think the other piece that I heard as I was putting the summary together, I heard a lot about it, was strong support for using the life cycle accounting and social cost of carbon as a standard for evaluation, as well as thinking about, as the costs increase in the electric sector for bringing in more renewables, making sure that there is a kind of more creative, innovative way of thinking about cost allocation, so that burden doesn't fall on low income families. And I think you did, Liz, try to get people to think about specific elements of the res design that you were interested in. I don't know if any of that came through as new or surprising from what you were looking for, but
yeah, no, I think your summary captures the discussion that we had well. Really, though, I was focused, because you absolutely are right about the comments that we got. And I'm not sure that the forum, I'm just putting it out there, I don't think the forum that we used offered an opportunity for other comments, just given the relatively limited, relatively still expert group of people that came, which was great. And, that's helpful, but it's not, I had been hoping that we were broadening the input, because I don't know if we would have heard the same recommendations on the things you just mentioned if we had. So that's just my going forward suggestion, thinking through how you're doing the, format of the meeting, the publication or invite / notification, and potentially the participation, in order to just make sure that the comments that come are either broader or more representative than we've heard in this forum.
And I think that is the intent, Jane, you can confirm, but that is the intent of the next set of public engagement. These were designed specifically to bring in experts on the topics. And the next set will be much broader in intent. And so to your issue about format, maybe we should talk a little bit about the other two who had some breakout sessions. So they had a little bit different approach. Christine, do you want to talk about some of the takeaways from the building sector workshop?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I don't think Dave is on the call today. I feel that the group that participated was the usual cast of characters and broader than those that have been participating in these Zoom meetings. But there weren't too many people on the call that I would say were new to the conversation. So I would echo some of what Liz was saying, although I didn't listen into the electric one. I think that generally speaking, anyone who wanted to have a chance to speak had a chance to speak. It was not a presentation heavy meeting, and I was glad about that. We broke into sector-based, subsector-based breakout groups. So anyone in the res or the commercial breakout group, I think, would have had an opportunity to share their thinking if they chose to. I don't think there were any surprises in the suggestions and concerns that were brought forward, with perhaps, for me anyway, one exception. Neil Lunderville, who's been helping, who's been one of the multiple leaders of the Weatherization at Scale EAN action team, posited the question of, what if we took 5 years and spent all our energy efficiency and weatherization and fuel switching and EV money to serve those below 120% adjusted median income, AMI, and completely different paradigm than what we've been operating under. And it was just a question. There was no prioritization or voting or ranking, but it was just, that was the one sort of surprise idea that stood out for me that I can remember now on the spot, of a whole different way of thinking about how to dedicate whatever resources we end up having to achieve these goals we've set for ourselves in a very targeted, focused way. There are others on this call who were involved with that workshop, so I welcome their memories too. It already seems like ancient history to me, I must admit. My apologies.
And I think that's a great summary. And anybody who wants to hear the specifics, the recordings are up for at least the first two workshops. The electricity and buildings, transportation will probably be coming soon. And the summaries give a little bit more detail on the substance in the breakouts, because those parts of those sessions were not recorded. So that's the only piece you'll be missing. You'd have to get that from the summaries themselves. So thanks. And then transportation, Joey and Gina, you want to pick up on that?
I guess I would say a few different things. There were a lot of, there were that sort of experts and practitioners in the room, which I thought was helpful. I think there was a lot to cover. When we're talking about transportation, digging into it, in that format was helpful in many ways and challenging in others, just because of the magnitude of the different, like, what we're tackling. Am I echoing for people? Okay, can someone mute themselves, whoever's on the phone?
I think that's Rich's phone. Rich, can you mute your phone?
Oh, sorry. Thank you. That was a little disconcerting. Sorry. Still there. Okay. I guess for me, it was very helpful, and there were some nuggets of like really important feedback that we will consider and apply. And at the same time, it was just generally high level, sort of like seem to acknowledge the direction we're going, and the conversation that we've been having to date about the different kinds of programs that we need to accelerate and expand. But I am very much looking forward to the public engagement process that is a very different animal than what I understood these stakeholder groups to be, which is just broader public engagement. And at some point, getting down to a level of specificity when we're talking about more clearly designing specific programs like, you know, Mileage Smart or an expanded transit program or a microtransit program or something along those lines. So it was helpful in many ways, and it was one piece of the puzzle. Gina, what would you add?
Well, I'm looking forward to reading Catherine's summary. It just dropped into our boxes this morning and I haven't had a chance to look at it. I was a little bummed out because we had some very specific questions we wanted answered, and those did get presented, but they were presented with like a lot of other questions. It was like playing 20 questions. And so the conversation wasn't, and we weren't facilitating, so we couldn't get to the stuff we were really hungry to hear about on. So that to me was frustrating. And the people there were all this there was a certain amount of same old, which who had some really good ideas, but there was nothing earth shattering, at least in my breakout session. I'm eager to see what went on in the other ones. So yeah, we'll keep at it. You know, now we're at the phase where we really want to start digging into the policies and the recommendations, and that's where the expert feedback is going to be really important. But unfortunately, we've had that meeting before we really had those gelled up, or at least we had them gelled up, but we didn't get to discuss them in that format.
Yeah, I hear you, and I agree that the way these were structured, it wasn't designed or didn't allow for a lot of really detailed feedback. First of all, there was too much substance to cover.
Right.
That said, I think there was real value in one, sort of what Joey said, some level of confirmation of you're going in the right direction, you're thinking about the right stuff. If there weren't any surprises, that was probably good. And two, I think it was really good for them to hear. They got a lot of information out of it, I think, and then to hear from each other and to see that there was maybe a growing agreement about at least some of the big stuff, the important stuff. So
yeah, I'd say a vast majority of those people we've already been talking to get us to the point where we're at right now. So yes, the confirmation was very valuable. It's the same people cycling through the same stuff.
Yeah. So again, I would just urge anybody who really wants to get into the nitty gritty to go to the recordings.
And can I just add something, Catherine, just in general? I mean, if people have thoughts about, you know, transportation folks that we should be connecting with, I feel like we put this overture out there to be like, who should we be talking with? And I feel like we're doing that work, you know, to the degree possible at this moment, but I very much welcome input on like, these are people you cannot move forward without like with some recommendation on X if you do not engage. So please, I mean, we've tried to cast a wide net and tried to be transparent in these proceedings. But you know, it's the same old because there are a lot of the folks who are doing this work and they're the practitioners, but I very much welcome input on who else if we are not capturing. So I will drop my email into this chat.
And I just, Ken just put something in the chat about there was a lot of hesitancy towards EVs, and you know, I've got to agree with that. I want to see the summary, but the people aren't ready to say EVs are our savior. The VMT reduction and transit options, particularly around equity, are issues we've heard in other states. We're hearing now, and I don't think we should fall into the same old trap as some of those other states of just counting on technology switch. We've got to, and that gets into land use. We need to tend to this VMT reduction issue and quantify it to the best we can.
Well, I think we will take some of your advice into the next set of, not so much the larger public engagement, but ag and ecosystems and rural resilience are also developing some specific targeted outreach. And I think I'm just working on the rural communities one, and they're trying to really, really focus in on just like one or two questions and, you know, leave it there. So that might help get a little more specific feedback. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate that conversation, that update. I know there is we always get the engagement. We always, whatever engagement we're getting, it's never complete. And that's why we're continuing to build out and away from us. And so we get more of those diverse viewpoints as we have those conversations. So the fact of the matter is we have a lot of substance, and that is a challenge to work through, but we're going to continue to do our best to bring that substance to bear in all of our conversations, and to put together a set of recommendations for the full council that meets those objectives and has that substance in it. So I do want to switch gears and get to some work planning for the next month. As you're all probably feeling, as I know I am, today is the 2nd of September. By October 5th, we are to be presenting to the full council a slate of recommended actions that will then get discussed and talked about and built into public engagement and ultimately into the plan. That doesn't mean that every final detail has to be fully entrenched by then that it will go into the plan, but we got to be moving quite far along and be ready in that process. That said, we also have lots of pieces in between now and then. We have modeling information that we're going to get more detail for the task leads on each of the sectors in conversations with David and others. And then we have to continue to refine and get things in the proper format. So I just wanted to sort of set the framework that we're in crunch time. And we're going to be operating in some ways with incomplete information for a little while, and we just have to keep moving forward the best we can and integrate that information as we go, so that we get that put this together. So Jane and Catherine and I have discussed a sort of wanted to go over sort of the rough schedule of what is going to occur, and then sort of build our milestones from there. Catherine, I may ask you to put that Word doc you put together up just to kind of share that and show, because I think it's a good visual for the next few weeks. And Christine, I see your hand. Do you want to, while Catherine's doing that, do you want to ask your question?
Maybe Catherine's going to answer this, but can you articulate in a couple of sentences what the next deliverable is that you are expecting and when from the task leads? Because I'm not clear about that.
Yep. So we're going to talk through that. Jane has been working on what that looks like. It's essentially a modified or an updated version of the spreadsheet that we worked with when we were developing our pathways and strategies, to then take that and fill out some more of that information in order to have it be ready for action level. We'll talk through some of those pieces. Jane, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, that was a helpful introduction, Peter. I do just want to say there's a lot of moving pieces and a lot of things coming into play over the course of the next few weeks. We have a really substantial steering committee meeting next week. I wanted to draw people's attention to one that will focus on teeing us up for the Climate Council meeting the following week. But at that meeting, we'll be talking about a number of pertinent issues that help us advance the work of the subcommittees for between now and the action presentations at the end of the month. So as part of that conversation, we'll think about, first and foremost, we're going to formalize a process that engages with counselors and state staff and subcommittees to figure out the components and milestones of drafting the climate action plan. That has been in play for a number of weeks now. That will be adopted by the steering committee and then presented to the full council on the 14th. That will speak to support for subcommittees and who is drafting what for the final climate action plan, and then also hope to direct resources for like templates and components of the CAP. In light of that, Marion and I have both been revisiting the templates that were provided to subcommittees back in June that would allow us hopefully a smooth transition from your work into the climate action plan. And specifically for cross-sector, I'll just say that we haven't seen spreadsheets from you all as task leads. So one of my questions today is sort of operating under the assumption that a consistent simplified template based on what was in June that enhances how we get to priority actions would be helpful for you all. And I say this all because ag and ecosystems and rural resilience have sort of moved into using their own spreadsheets, and we're going to build in their spreadsheets how we get at prioritization, but plan to adopt a template specifically for all of you, so we can talk about that today a bit. And then finally, as I was alluding to in those templates, this question of prioritization and at what level where it happens has been coming up, and we've spent, it'll be an amazing feat if the steering committee and then the council moves forward with accepting it, because between Marion, myself, and CBI staff, we've spent hours sort of grappling with the process of prioritization and how to do it efficiently in our timeline, and present a clear process that hopefully the council will adopt with modifications based on the steering committee and then perhaps other councilors engaged in the drafting process. That will all happen pretty quickly. And the idea being that you all are up for a full council meeting dedicated to cross-sector on October 5th. The expectation, though, for councilors that we're going to set on the 14th is that work products will be sent to councilors a week ahead of time as best practice, because just think of how many actions the council is going to have to digest in that one meeting. The intent is really that they will have had a week with the materials ahead of time, so that the meeting is a snapshot of the key relevant sort of issues that you want to dive into, but not a comprehensive list of all actions. They will have had that, and they can direct questions to all of you, so that there's no, just, brutal honesty, there's no room in the schedule for counselors to keep kicking the can to next meetings and asking for more time. So it's really beholden on the subcommittees to get the work up through us to the counselors well in advance of the meeting, so that folks have time to review it. So this all means for me that you'll have more clarity around the templates we're expecting. Hopefully next week at your meeting, I can share those templates after the steering committee discusses it on Tuesday, which will include both a spreadsheet and a presentation template for the end of the month, as well as a prioritization framework that you can use to work through your action items. And my final comment, as you're thinking about schedule, is around the equity component of your work and facilitation. We did receive and have begun a contract process for facilitation services to support subcommittees in the application of the scoring rubric. My expectation is that that will move pretty quickly now, and we'll have that person on board next week. And the expectation that sometime one of your meetings will likely have to be dedicated to that. And I'll just propose that that will likely need to be a longer meeting just to really lean in, but I won't have guidance on that quite yet till we start to really speak with that person. So that's a lot, and maybe not enough clarity around that, but it does really mean that hopefully building back, you're really actually building towards the week before October 5th for presentation via the templates that we'll provide.
Jane,
Maybe I just overwhelmed you all.
well, Jane, could you clarify whether the contractor on the equity contractor would be, you would expect would be able to provide that type of help before October 5th so that it's integrated into the presentations, or will that come after the October 5th?
Our hope is that it'll be before October 5th, but everything's feeling so tight right now. So that's our hope.
Okay.
Our hope, we have a scheduled meeting in our milestones for the October 12th council meeting to focus on equity consolidated up at the council. So it will have already happened at the subcommittees before then.
Before
if things go according to plan.
Before October
Before
12th,
October
you said?
12th.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So just Jane, and I know the challenges we've had in particular in finding somebody to take on that contract. Just from a logistics standpoint, I'm assuming we're gonna have homework that comes out of that conversation with the just transition contractor. And I'm just wondering where we have time to do, and yeah.
Yeah, I'm simply highlighting it as a placeholder, but completely hear you on timeline. And so I hope that will be refined in the next week. But only just got the bid on Wednesday, so just starting to think through it.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I get it. Gina and then Christine.
Can we get this template ASAP? Because as we sit down with the consultants next week, we want to be able to say, can you deliver this or can you deliver that on our various action items? And in these meetings with staff to sort of help figure out what the state already has or doesn't have around these different initiatives is going to be critical. Because as I said in the chat, I don't mind a spreadsheet. I just need to figure out the place where I'm going to find the information to put into the spreadsheet. I can't make up a bunch of numbers. Somebody's got to be helping us find those numbers around economic benefit, costs, emissions, whatever.
I would, just as a key point, Gina, I think the point for all task leads to be thinking of is you are responsible for fleshing out the ideas in the template right up until the point where we understand what their full impacts are. And then we can have support from various contractors for the equity impacts of those and for the GHG and economic impacts of those. So think about it from that context.
So you're looking for a narrative from us, to me, which doesn't speak to spreadsheet. Spreadsheet.
Gina, this is why we talked about this months ago, to put it in there just because we need them all in one place. We need all the ideas in one place. And if we put them in lots of different PowerPoint slides, it's great for presentation, but it's not very good for evaluating them all together. And so the spreadsheet is not necessarily about calculating all the numbers as much as it is keeping it all in one place. So
it's a list. It's a list.
It's a useful way to manage a list. And obviously there will be some numbers that we can use the spreadsheet to analyze as a whole, but it's not going to be in some ways that granular. Christine, you had your hand up and then took it down. Do you have?
I think you just answered my question, and I just want to affirm that what I think the building sector is prepared to do is to give you the high-level policy and programmatic recommendations, but not this net costs and benefits, the net greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera. You cannot be relying on a volunteer group of people to be doing that work for the state. And it's, I just want to make that really, really clear. That's what the consultants should be doing.
So I guess I just want to respond to that, because I know this has been a point for you, Christine, and I completely appreciate that. The way that we are thinking about how they will be evaluated, and for cross-sector, we might want to dive into this a little more, but we have been thinking about the 5 criteria that we've been putting forward now, and thinking about cost effectiveness, greenhouse impact, and impact for you all is greenhouse gas emission reduction. It's for for ag and eco, sequestration, resilience, et cetera, goals. It's equity, it's co-benefits, and then I'm forgetting one. There's one more. Mary is on
technical feasibility.
Feasibility, yes, feasibility. Joey, I knew you'd get me on that one because you know that you like that one. And so some of them are quantitative for you all, but the way we've been thinking about this at this point with respect to prioritizing, we've been thinking about high, medium, and low. And one of the things that we're hoping to do with the steering committee is agree on definitions for those 5 criteria, have a way we evaluate them and a way we pull it all together. And so some of that, I think there's going to actually be a balance, and some of it as an expectation that like the co-benefits piece. Like that is something you all could do through professional judgment. That's not really a contractor. It's like a, land use has, like benefits for greenhouse gas. This is not a great example, but a specific action around that has multiple benefits for resilient sequestration. This will all become clearer after next week, but I do, as I'm looking at the body of work, some of it will be done by contractors and some of more than probably we might have thought will fall to subcommittee members. And therefore, as we move through this, we're going to want to think about staff support. And I highlight that for Peter, I highlight that for others, because that's certainly how ag and ecosystems and rural resilience are getting to this point right now. They have dedicated staff support who are immensing, putting the information together, helping to sort, helping to consolidate. And that's a bigger job for them because they have a longer list of actions and strategies perhaps than you all do, because ultimately the consultant's going to tell you what you need for emissions reductions, and all of those are going to need to be included. So feasibility in our definition is about technical feasibility, but you all should, cost effectiveness is by itself. Thank you.
So to Christine, to your broader question, there will be data that we don't expect you to bring to the table on your own. At the same time, there are many things in there around co-benefits that we understand, at having done this work and done the research into these various things, that we can articulate at least in a qualitative way. And we probably will not get to the point where we have quantitative measures, right? And so being able to articulate, I'm happy to iterate with any of the task leads on your specific ideas and how we might fill out that template, because it really, we are going to rely on your best professional judgment in instances where the data isn't clear at this point. So, or we won't have time to have gotten to that level of analysis on health co-benefits or whatever else of various tasks, various actions. Richard? We can't hear you.
He has to unmute his phone now.
Do you think you need to hit *6?
All right.
You are unmuted.
Well, thank you. Hey, Peter, thanks. I think the 5 criteria are great, by the way, asking us to take our recommended policies and say something about them along those 5 criteria. And I'm agreeing with Peter and Christine too, that we will look to the consultants to help us with the cost effectiveness data and projected emission reductions. So I think that's feasible for us to fill out a template that includes attention to those 5 criteria. The prioritization of high, medium, and low, maybe there's a sophisticated something behind it, and the steering committee will be able to hash that out. But it seems to me that one of the big factors affecting high, medium, and low is going to be speed, and whether this is something that can be that can help us achieve significant reductions by 2030 or not. And maybe that'll be a major criterion in the high, medium, and low, but I'd want to make sure we don't lose the temporal element as we consider how to prioritize things.
Jane, can I take from your comments that it is still up for discussion among the steering committee as in the council, I guess, as to where this prioritization will take place, whether it will take place at the strategies level or the actions, sort of as the actions as a whole level?
The way we are proposing it in the process is, now I'm getting the echo, is at the action level. And I mean, I don't want to belabor the prioritization right now because I feel like there's a lot of background and information that I could share that goes into that, and it hasn't been considered at another level. So there is one coming. We are thinking a lot about it, and there'll be opportunity both at the steering committee and then the council to weigh in.
Okay. And one more hand from Johanna.
Well, we don't need to belabor prioritization, but I'm also kind of wondering about calling it prioritization or sequencing. Like, I mean, in terms of like what our consultants just laid out, what we need to do and accomplish. And I think we got a lot to do. And I do wonder about how it shows up in the plan in terms of like initial priorities and like things that we need to set the stage to do a bit later, like down the road. So anyway, just offering that as a thought, because we're gonna need to do a lot. That echo.
Richard, can you hit *6 again?
It's *6 again.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. So yep. So we're not gonna produce a result that has everything we'd like it to have, all the level of analysis, all of the detailed prioritization work that's going to happen. We're going to do the best we can to make recommendations on what we think are the best policy choices for the council to consider. We can contain in there that sort of technical feasibility, to me, to some extent has an opportunity to say that, has some temporal nature to it, right? And there's an opportunity to provide some of that qualitative discussion. There's opportunities across the board. I think what we need to get to now is nuts and bolts. So assuming 9/28, we are delivering our spreadsheets into whatever templates we're using to the full council. That means that we have 26 days. And presuming one of our meetings, we need to devote to the equity consultant helping us apply the just transitions framework. And we'll want to go through some of the template, the templated items. We've got lots to get to. And so I'm just wondering how folks are interested in managing those meetings. So Jane, I can't see what you're writing in chat. Do you want to just say them so that I can
Sure.
follow?
So Catherine had proposed reviewing templates for prioritization and presentation next week. My feeling is that actually, like, I will share those today with all of you. Marion, I was checking with her. I was waiting for her to give me her good thoughts and feedback on what I put together, because I know she'll have great ideas to streamline and communicate effectively with you around it. So as soon as I get that back today, I'll share that with all of you. And if you would like to consider a day to like have feedback on it and make any revisions, happy to do that, or just go for it. Like, trust in that they'll be pretty straightforward and they're built off of what we saw back in June. We'll highlight what to populate, but I'll just say that I think at a pathway and strategy level, they need to be populated by next week. And then we got to talk about a plan to start to think about how the action items get put in and populated, because what's been happening at the other subcommittees is all the pathways and strategies are together now, and now they're starting to like sort of ruthlessly prioritize at that level, so that and make sure things like duplicate strategies, or I don't think that's going to be as big of a deal for you all, because they had task leads who were working in different areas but had a lot of overlap, so there was a lot of like consolidation and cleanup that needed to happen. I suspect that won't happen for you all, but worth checking. And then once those are there, we need to like get all the action items in the spreadsheet. Really, it's like a week to 10 days. It's because that's where the work has to happen over the course of the next few weeks at the action level.
Jane, would it be possible for us to put our action items in And then you and staff can populate the numbers that you know exist, or it will be determined when Cadmus finishes X, Y, Z. So we don't waste a lot of time trying to fill in the boxes. We'll
So
put in.
You
what we
mean for
know,
metrics,
but
for
you-
metrics, or
the
I'm not sure what you're
well, the
referring to.
metrics or whatever it is, cost effectiveness, whatever, whatever things are in this template, we'll put in the list of actions. And then it goes back to you guys. You say, here's what we can figure out by when to help us.
So
Thank
Gina, I think what we're asking for you is to put as this, down to the action level.
Yeah,
And
no,
as much of the information as you have.
yeah,
And if you don't have it, you're not putting it in.
okay. We don't have to go searching for it
No.
online or, whatever, doing research on TCI and what the latest, greatest thing is from them. And you guys will, just for an example.
Right. We have, you've had staff support with Dan and Deidre, who can help work through pull some of those pieces in.
Okay,
We can happily get down into some of those details, but a lot of it you will be able to answer. It's not to the level of detail that goes beyond your professional capacity.
okay,
I will give the example of the non-energy test. Our strategies and pathways or pathways and strategies are all in, right? We did that back in June or July, whenever that was. We can modify them quickly to be in the current format and adapt accordingly. So adding actions into that will not be a significant challenge. I think, I hope copying and pasting from what you have all done previously to create the presentations for pathways and strategies, it will not be that much of a challenge either, frankly, and then breaking them out to the action level. But it is useful as an organizing effort to understand how they all nestle in together.
Peter, I don't want to take us backwards because I haven't been on all of these meetings, but is everybody clear on what an action is and what is expected, the level of detail expected for an action? Have you had that discussion enough already?
1,700 times.
Okay, all right. Definitely
I
won't
hope.
take you backwards.
Thanks,
Apologize.
Kathy. I mean, if anybody wants to ask that question offline, I'm happy to answer that question, but I think we can probably move forward.
So just looking at this sort of sequence of the different technical consultant tasks and when they're going to come in, want to make sure that we understand how that might affect what you're pulling together by October. So next week, it will be the individual meetings with the task leads so that you can be clear with what analysis will be done and what they may need from you or what information you think might be missing. That's what I heard from David, is that there's going to be opportunity to go over all of those questions with the consultants. And that will give you hopefully the information you need at least to keep moving forward with your actions and populating those templates to bring forward by the 9th. The question is, I guess, then on the 9th, are we asking everybody to present their actions to the full subcommittee for discussion, or in addition to some conversation around the prioritization process itself? What would you want to do on the 9th once we get that far?
I would appreciate, I think, and this is my perspective, is that it's a familiarization presentation, right? Because there's going to be no way that we're all going to be able to weigh in on the equity conversation with the Just Transitions contractor if we're not familiar with what the actions are. And so that would be the sort of level of presentation I would hope to go through with the individual task leads.
So it's not a debate or deliberations, just a sort of here's what we're thinking about, here's what we're putting forward. for further analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I would also, I would, given that we're working sort of by consensus here, I think it would be a great opportunity for anybody who has a serious concern with one of the items to raise that net at that point, so that we're not waiting until the final meeting on the week of 9/23 to provide that feedback. Or at the meeting on 9/23. That makes sense? Richard, I see your hand.
Yeah, I just want to say I agree with what you just said. I think it's important that the committee gets a look at the templates as filled out by each of the task groups, and also that we have an opportunity to raise any hardcore fundamental issues as a full committee when we discuss them on the 9th. And so I agree completely with what Peter just said. And I think it's a good discipline for us to have to reduce these ideas to the template so that they can be all seen together. The consultants, we'll have this sort of disciplined, organized way of asking the consultants to help us with the data where we don't have it. And that will have to happen later in the month.
And to be sure that everybody is clear, my understanding is at this meeting, you are not expected to have prioritized them because you don't have all the information from the consultant, but just to have them at least in the spreadsheet so that they're all there. So correct me if I got that one wrong.
No, I think that's spot on, and that's a great message for everybody. We
Okay.
are inputting the information that we have to this point. We're going to have a lot of gaps that we don't know. But we gotta have a starting point, and it'll be much easier for us to continue to add that information if it's all in the same format.
Okay. So moving quickly, you'll the following week, you will be getting the analysis on the cost benefit from the scenario analysis. So you'll be getting that information presumably early in the week. So you'll have at least a chance to start looking at it. And thinking about how that informs the prioritization. You'll also then, if we focus on presenting that information at our meeting on the 16th, so I'm assuming we'll get a more formal presentation of all that. Scenario analysis, right? Then we'll also have the equity conversation, hopefully, at the same time. So that will kind of help start completing the information you need to do the prioritization. Anything else I guess to me, it seems like that would, just making sure that everybody has what they need. We have a discussion of anything that you feel like you might want further down the line, but this would be to set you up for the prioritization that would have to happen before the 23rd. Outcomes presented to see. So this is outcomes from where? I'm not sure I understand what this is. This next 9/20 week, outcomes presented to the.
That is the week of when the final outcomes from CADMIS and ESG would be presented.
Oh,
so I feel like I feel a little bit apologetic that there's a lot of moving pieces right now, and I think the most critical component in my mind for all of you is for us to get the information that you have in a consistent place and format, and I'm hopeful that by doing that, while also moving forward with finalizing the timeline for when the equity consultant will be available to you, also finalizing the expectation and scope around prioritization, whether that would really have to be completed prior to the presentation on the 5th. All of that, I feel like would have a much clearer picture after the steering committee meeting next week, although I'm putting a lot of faith in that, as well as working through the contract with the consultant. But there's just been a lot of things in flux right now. And for me, I'm actually having a hard time also probably because of how condensed the timeline is in front of all of us, figuring out how to like succinctly iron this out for you all right now. But what is like painfully clear is that we have to get it all in a format that will allow us to elevate the actions that we want to discuss for equity, as well as elevate the actions that we'll be able to prioritize for this climate action plan, which to me speaks to the utilization of the template. So I can share that today with all of you, and then we can commit to having that for next week in order to elevate the work out of each subcommittee at an action level, as well as then provide clarity around expectations for work planning for the next few weeks, doing some back work to bring to you next week.
All right. I think, Jane, that's helpful. I would agree. I think the key task for between now and next week is to take the templates that we'll get from Jane, integrate our strategy, pathways, strategies, and actions into that spreadsheet, and to be ready to present them for discussion purposes and for gut checks at our meeting next Thursday. And then we will need to continue to revise the schedule based on an updated sense of information for what we're going to get back from Cadmus and EFG, also a conversation around what we know about the Just Transitions contractor, and sort of revise this middle section. But I do think that there's no way around the sort of final discussion of the scenario analysis and presentation materials for the 9/23 meeting. So it's sort of that interim meeting period that we need a little bit of clarity that hopefully next week will provide at the steering committee meeting, Jane, if that's what I'm hearing. Is there any concern with that as a general path? And I appreciate the hard work that it's going to take. This is where we're going to take a lot of the work that we've done and put it in a good and useful form. So thank you all for doing that work. I would ask Richard, I don't know if you can stick around. I do have a hard stop now. I was wondering if you could lead the subcommittee through the public comment process.
Yes, I can do that.
Great, thank you. Great, thank you.
Is there any further discussion from the committee at this point about the process for the coming 2-3 weeks? And if not, I would like to turn to public comment. And Jane, you might, if
Richard, I can't hear you. I don't think your volume's up high enough.
okay, how about now?
Better.
Okay, so if we could perhaps stop sharing the screen, we could see if there are any members of the public who'd like to address the committee. Are there members of the public who would like to address the committee? I see Chase Whiting.
Hi, one quick question for David, if you're still on. If not, maybe TJ, if you're on. I'm just calling through to see who's here. Going back to the beginning of this meeting where there's a discussion around the proposed LEAP model. I'm curious to know, since I think I heard TJ say that it was based on the current assumptions that exist in the inventory right now, and I know that coming out of the Science and Data Subcommittee, there's talk around an RFI to learn more about upstream emissions or life cycle emissions, however it ultimately gets sort of defined. I'm curious to know if the current LEAP model, as it now is capable of modeling out in time in the way it is now for the sort of sector-based gross emissions that we're now using. Is it capable of incorporating sensitivities around life cycle or upstream emissions? Just want to know how complete the LEAP model could be, given that that sort of life cycle accounting, as we know, is incorporated into the GHG reduction requirements in 578A. Appreciate any thoughts on that. And just as a quick follow-up to that question, if it can be incorporated, I'm curious to know like how it would be done to the extent that can be described now. And if it can't, if life cycle accounting can't be incorporated into LEAP, I'm curious to know what sorts of additional things could be done to get us there. Thank you.
I can
David, do you have
comment
any
on
comment on
that
that?
briefly. Yeah. So a couple different things, Chase. I think that the recommendation coming out of that subcommittee is that this is something to continue to be considered in mitigation scenarios and analyses. It can be incorporated. LEAP and the emissions factors, can be modified to include both emissions from transformation, upstream emissions that are happening outside of Vermont, the emissions factors associated with different transformation modules or demand modules. Those individual emissions factors can be modified. My guess is in the current state of work that was just that's laid out and discussed and the deadlines in here, that we're not going to be doing that. Just being honest, it's there are an enormous number of pieces moving currently, but the Data and Science Subcommittee recommended, and the report that we wrote and that it was forwarded on to the council now recommends that continuing work to look at upstream and potentially life cycle emissions and to help distinguish between those is an important thing to consider going forward. Is that going to be done in the timelines that were just being discussed? And is that where these groups are going to be working on next? My guess is no, there's no way that's going to happen. I don't know, Jane, if I characterized that correctly, but.
Thanks, David.
Yeah.
Any other public comments? Anything else from members of the committee? All right, well, as we've just discussed, we have a lot of work to do in the coming week. Jane, you're going to send out the template and the spreadsheet right away, and everybody else, good luck, and please reach out to me and to Peter and to Jane if you have any questions about how to proceed. All right, I think we're ready to stand adjourned.
Thanks.
Thanks, Richard.
Anything further? All right, we are adjourned. Thanks.